broken down as he gave evidence. North America correspondent Barbara Miller has more.
Joe, that was 61-year-old Charles McMillan. He happened upon the altercation between police and George Floyd outside the convenience store where he'd used a fake $20 bill. Some footage shown to the court showed Mr. McMillan interacting with police at the scene. He told them that he thought that Mr. Floyd was going to have a heart attack, and he told a police officer that he didn't respect what he was doing. He also tried to tell George Floyd not to resist arrest, and his take there was, "You can't win." Mr. McMillan said that because he himself had had previous interactions with police, he knew that you just simply had to comply. Now, he was shown some graphic footage, as was the court, of course, of scenes around the arrest, and he really just totally broke down, put his head in his hands and started sobbing. In the end, a unscheduled stop in proceedings was called to allow him to compose himself. He told the court essentially that he'd felt helpless, and let's hear him now, because essentially he knew he was watching George Floyd die.
I heard him keep trying to ask them to let him up so he can't breathe, and then even I said to the officer, I said, "Man, he said he can't breathe." They said, "Well, if he keep talking, he can breathe." When the paramedics arrived for Mr. Floyd, I knew then in my mind and my instinct it was over for Mr. Floyd. He was dead.
And Barbara, the court also heard from a young store worker and his dilemma about whether to flag that George Floyd had used a counterfeit bill. What did he have to say?
That's right, this was a young man. He's now 19 years old, Christopher Martin. He was working in that convenience store at the time. And when George Floyd came in and handed him that $20 bill, that fateful bill for cigarettes, he said he kind of knew that it was counterfeit and he thought he should just maybe accept the bill, but then he reflected on the fact that he would have to pay for it because employees at that store had been trained to recognize counterfeit bills and told that that money would come out of their paycheck if they accepted them. So he alerted his manager. He was asked to go and speak to Mr. Floyd, who by this time was outside the store in a car, and ask him to come back into the store. He went out twice with co-workers. George Floyd didn't come in, and it was at that point that the manager called police. Now, this young man was then, as many people, a witness to what unfolded there, and he said that he just watched on with disbelief and guilt. He was asked why he felt guilt, and he said, if I'd just never taken that bill, then all of this could be avoided. And he said that he stays awake at night apologizing to George Floyd. So I think with those two witnesses, we really got a sense today of the lasting impact on bystanders of witnessing those events in May last year.
Yeah, and so another confronting day on a number of fronts in court, with this footage from a police body cam shown to the court.
That's right. We saw some footage from Derek Chauvin, the man on trial's body cam. That was the first time that had been seen. We also saw essentially the whole scene play out on the body cam footage of the three officers with him. It was very confronting. It would have been the first time that many people had seen that footage. We saw, for example, that as George Floyd lay on the ground under the knee of Derek Chauvin, that he became less and less responsive. You could hear bystanders calling out, "Check his pulse, check his pulse." At one point, Derek Chauvin seems to ask his colleagues how they are. One of them responds that he's got a bit of a scratch on his knee, but he'll be okay. One of the officers, I believe Officer Lane, says at one point that we should perhaps roll him on his side. Derek Chauvin seems to suggest that that's not necessary. So really watching, because of the full body cam footage from these three officers, Officer Chauvin's body cam was knocked off him, so his footage is not complete. But watching three times over, I guess, the final moments of George Floyd's life, very, very confronting for the court today.
Barbara Miller there in Washington. Now here's David Chow with business news.
Australian property prices have risen at their fastest pace in 32 years, driven by record low interest rates and not enough houses for sale to keep up with the red-hot demand. The national median price went up 2.8% in March to $615,000, which is a new record high according to the latest CoreLogic figures. It's the biggest monthly increase since October 1988, and that figure includes both houses and apartments. Meanwhile, the most expensive market, Sydney, has recovered from its short-lived coronavirus downturn. Its median price surged 3.7% last month to $928,000. Melbourne has also recovered from its COVID correction, with prices up 2.4% there. Now, the Australian share market has begun its day with small gains after a mixed performance on Wall Street. So far, the best performing sectors are technology and materials, while real estate stocks are a slight drag on the market. So the ASX 200 is up 0.1%. Well, now it's a bit down, while the All Ords is doing a bit better, but it's still practically flat. And about 6 out of every 10 stocks are trading higher on the top 200 index. Now, this morning's best performers are AMP, up 2.5%, along with BlueScope Steel, the building materials company Boral, and gold stocks like Northern Star Resources. And not doing so well are property stocks like Dexus and Cromwell Property Group. Now, you would have noticed that AMP shares went up sharply. That's after the company announced its chief executive, who's been in the role for just over 2 years, will step down after a lot of speculation about his future. AMP says Francesco Di Ferrari will retire as the company completes a portfolio review. He'll be replaced by Alexis George, the deputy CEO of ANZ Bank, in the third quarter. AMP says Mr. Di Ferrari will stay on during the interim period to ensure a smooth transition to Ms. George. Now, tech stocks on Wall Street surged as investors await details of US President Joe Biden's massive infrastructure plan worth more than $2.5 trillion. That sent the NASDAQ up 1.5%. The S&P went up by 1/3%, while the Dow Jones went down slightly by 1/4%. Now, oil prices are a bit mixed. They fell a bit sharply overnight, with West Texas crude down to $59.1 per barrel, while gold prices saw a big jump overnight. Gold now at $1,708 an ounce. And the Australian dollar went a bit backwards as the US greenback strengthened. It's now buying just below 76 US cents.
Thanks, David. With the disappointment around the cancellation of the Byron Blues Festival hanging in the air,